podcast. My name is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the second Sunday after Christmas Day for the week of January 4th, 2026. And I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig into this week's podcast, and I'm excited based on where you're at when you're listening to this and when it exactly is. It could potentially be, but I'll at least say it even early for a few of us, Happy New Year as we roll into 2026. Now, again, if this is early in the week, I will say there's one more podcast that I'll quickly drop. I always try doing something around the anniversary. It'll be probably a little bit shorter, I think, this year, but a couple things that I'll try announcing and kind of talking about a little bit on looking back to what we've accomplished here in 2025, but also what are some things that I'm looking at trying to cook up here in 2026. And it's been a successful year. I've really enjoyed this year. I think it's been another really good year for the podcast, but I don't want to spoil everything. And that's not what we're talking about this week. So let's just look back at the question that we had for last week as we are in this Christmas season, which is an amazing time of year. Where do we need to lean into trusting God further so that we can show our faith better? And I think there was a really good response this week talking about how there's a lot of things that are going on within the world that sometimes are beyond our control. And yes, there's little bits and aspects of things that we can do to help in some of that, but there's also major aspects of this. And I think it's one of the things that we need to especially kind of think about a little bit of our Old Testament roots is the aspect of prayer. We need to be able to pray and recognize that there are things that are beyond our ability to be able to affect. And thus we have to trust that God is handling it, that that's not necessarily for us to hold, that isn't necessarily for us to work with, and recognizing that in that's what God takes over. And I think that's one of these moments, one of these reflection points for us that we need to continue to reflect upon as we, yes, as people, we should be informed of what's going on, but also recognize that these are then things for us to be bringing to God to pray about. Recognizing that God's there and God's waiting for us at times to talk to God about that. And I think sometimes that's one of the big key aspects that it's easy for us to overlook. But let's just jump into it this week. We have a lot of readings here for this second Sunday after Christmas Day. So one of the Old Testament texts can be out of Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 7 to 14. So this is, again, in this aspect of the prophet Jeremiah laying out what are the prophecies of what the people are going to be going through. And one of the big aspects of this is that the flock has been scattered, and yet it's going to be re-brought back together. And that's coming out of the line of Jacob, which gets repeated a lot. And that fits with the year of Matthew that we're in, even though the gospel this week is not out of Matthew. But it's this recognition on how this has all been laid out before. So we are giving praise to God, recognizing that God has not abandoned us. God has been able to work on bringing the people back together, even though right now, at the current moment of when this was being prophesied, they feel scattered. But God is not abandoning them. Continue to give praise to God. They shall have their times of dancing and being merry, as we get in verse 13, turning our sorrow into joy, this idea of how we are trusting in God, and God then continues to fulfill God's promise in God's time. The other alternative Old Testament text this week is out of the Apocrypha, out of Sirach, chapter 24, verses 1 to 12. This is then looking at the aspect of when we are looking for wisdom and we are acknowledging the wisdom of what is around us and in us. That is when we're able to give glory. That is when we're able to give praise. And this is something that is accomplished over time. And when we are able to see it, then we are able to see how the wisdom of God is in and amongst us and around us all over. And that we are being part of the inherited people to be able to inherit bits and pieces of this wisdom is truly incredible. And it gets us to a place of praise. We also have alternative Psalms this week. So one of the Psalms that you can choose from is from Psalms 147 verses 12 to 20. And again, this is praising God and recognizing that God continues to bless God's children. Even though that there has been hardships, even though that there is hard things that goes on and things seem to be crumbling in front of them, God still declares and brings forth his people to be able to fulfill the praises of what God is wanting, is being able to bring us to a place and being able to unite us stronger than we were before. The other alternative psalm this week is out of the Wisdom of Solomon, which is out of also the Apocrypha, starting in chapter 10, verses 15 to 21. This is also then recognizing that we serve a God who has taken control over things in ways that we can't fully explain, recognizing that it's not this typical king and then his servants under him relationship, that this is something that where God is working with us and partnering with us to be able to free us. And this is where we get into verses 17 and 18, getting into how he was able to guide us through, specifically here, looking back to when we were slaves in Egypt as a tribe of Israel, and casting and freeing them from their different enemies that were causing them to be in slavery, having the hardships. So recognizing that through that communication, through being true and open and honest with God, the wisdom of God was able to be shown and be portrayed. So for us, then, we need to be able to willingly and openly be able to connect with God in that same way. The New Testament text or epistle text this week is from Ephesians chapter 1, verses 3 through 14. This then is, now that we've gotten through and we're looking back on the life of Christ, it's this same recognition, recognizing that we are adopted into this family of God, and that even though we did not deserve it, there was one who went on our behalf, who was sacrificed on our behalf to give us the forgiveness that we were needing. And thus, us being able to recognize that insight and live that insight out, thus having that wisdom that is stirred up within us and living that out continuously, recognizing that this was a gift that was given to us, and thus we should be able to show and live out that gift continually. And this is then an echo of praise through us recognizing the gift of what has been given to us, and us sharing that gift with others is that gift. The gospel text this week is out of John chapter 1, optionally verses 1 to 9, and then 10 through 18. This, to me, and many have stated, the beginning of John almost does seem like poetry in and of itself. It's a beautiful section of scripture. It's one of my favorite sections of scripture, just with how it is written. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light to all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overtake it, and we move on from there. This recognition then also within this text of how this man of John was sent. And we get this kind of feeling of John the Baptist, but this idea of how John was sent to be the forerunner for Christ, that he was not the light, but was going to be turning people toward the light, bringing the people back together, helping to bring the tribes of Israel back together, bringing the believers back toward God, and recognizing here, especially at the end of this text, that this is God's embodiment in human flesh, that this is going to be both God and human, that God is coming to be with us. And so this then opens that relationship up in a very different way for us then to be also seeking for us to connect with God then. If God was willing to go and be there for us, then we should be able to go and be there with God. So before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do a shameless plugs for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions. Since I'm an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas, direction, being able to listen to some great biblical scholars going through and talking about and looking at these texts week to week is an amazing resource over there. And I'd highly recommend checking out workingpreacher.org if you haven't done that already. Second of all, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but also having art, prayers, hymns, daily devotions or readings to get into the text week after week. Again, if we look at worship as a 1 day a week thing, we then have to also then prepare for it. If you want to put it into American terms here, football teams don't just show up on Sunday and perform. They have practice throughout the whole week to prepare for those games. So thus, we should be getting and preparing week after week on many days to get us prepared for worship to really be able to get as much out of it as we possibly can. So if you haven't checked out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I would argue this was a great resource to help you in that preparing for worship week after week. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising Publications. It's either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies throughout these texts, going along with the weekly readings like we do week after week. There's some more of an ecological lens to these. There's some great ecological ways to be thinking about and talking about these, and you have some amazing writers over there. So if you haven't checked out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable or the Green Blades Rising publication, that'll be the first link down in the references section of the show notes. I think this week, one of the things that we have to think about and look at and contemplate is, what does it truly mean to have wisdom and to seek after wisdom and to listen to wisdom? And I think that's a hard thing in and of itself, and especially when we're trying to look at it also from a scientific lens. There's the idea of understanding of research and understanding of things that have been done before, but you still have to have a critical thinking to be able to think, well, what test can I do slightly differently, or what test deserves to be redone, and thinking about it from that perspective. But I think there's other ways of looking at this as well. I think one of the things that jumped out to me when I was looking at these texts this week is, okay, we have the prophet Jeremiah talking about it's going to be bringing the people back together. And at that point, that seemed far-fetched. When we talk about Sirach here and that wisdom is going to give us the praise that we're looking for, even though that we've gone through all this hardship, again, that seems far-fetched. We give praise to God and He strengthens His children and blesses His children and recognizes all these things where He makes us white as snow type of ideas that we're getting out of the Psalm 147. Again, that seems far-fetched, and we see that yet again in the wisdom of Solomon, and reminding us back to when we were slaves and being led out, that seemed far-fetched before that, and recognizing that still we lose sight of that. And Ephesians kind of bringing us back to that same thing of we had Christ embodied right here in and amongst us and went and died for us. So thus we should be living that out in a way that we otherwise can't explain. And so then we get into the blueprint, if you want to put it that way, that we get in here at the beginning of John, and the aspect of God wanting to come and be and live amongst us. And what does that look like? And I think one of the things then as we get into this, and one of the aspects when we think about the Gospels as a whole, is when Jesus entered the world, it's not the way that we're expecting. It's not in the way that we would expect. It's not in the way that people were expecting. It's a very different way, and especially now if we're being on this side of the cross, having heard the story for generation after generation after generation, we lose sight of that. It's easy for us to think, oh, it's the Christmas story and Jesus comes as a baby. And of course Jesus came as a baby because that would be the beginning of life. And yet that's not how the people were expecting. They were wanting a liberating hero. They were wanting a king. They were wanting somebody to be able to bring forth this new evidence, this new way of freeing and liberating the people in a way that hadn't been done before. And so I think at times, then we also have to think about how we live life, how we live out our science, how we do different things in a slightly different light. And I know before I've brought up the National Christmas Bird Count, or the Audubon Christmas Bird Count, which is now international. It's not just national. And what is that? Let's get into a little bit of the history of that, and let's think about this. What it was at the turn of the last century, traditionally on Christmas Day, that people would go out and do a Christmas bird hunt. And so you had ornithologist Frank Chapman think, well, maybe instead of killing the birds, let's do a counting of the birds. Now, especially as even today, as we're up north in the northern half of the northern hemisphere, we get this label that the birds all go south. The birds aren't here. There's very few birds. And having experienced many of these, and now it has been a few years and I need to get back and do some of these, but there's nothing further from the truth. Wherever you are, I can guarantee you right now, there are birds in your area. It's just a question of, are you open and willing to hear them? Are you open and willing to do the practice to be able to hear them, to acknowledge them, to see them? So right now, how these Christmas bird counts work, you have a count circle, which is a diameter of 15 miles across. You need at least some volunteers. It suggests now at minimum 10. And these counts happen between 2 weeks before and 2 weeks after Christmas. So between December 14th and January 5th. And it's the biggest civilian science project in the world, that you're taking lots of regular people going out and counting birds. And having gone and done these in Wisconsin, and I guess most all of mine have been in Wisconsin, but up in Minnesota as well, are these areas that are cold. The idea is the birds aren't there. And what you end up doing is you end up having to slow down. It's recognizing, okay, if I'm a bird, where would I be? So what type of day is it? Is it a cold day? Okay, then there's certain types of birds that I might be going and looking for in specific types of pine trees and things of that nature. Is there open water somewhere? Well, if there's open water, there's going to be birds coming and getting a drink. You might have a lot of your waterfowl in open areas, and that's a big thing. Feeding stations, people putting up bird feeders and different things of that nature. Of course, there's going to be birds there because it's a reliable food source and a hard time to get food, and they desperately need it. And so thus you have to be willing and able to look for those places. Maybe you're more in a mature forest. What do you have to do? Well, you have to stop. You need to look, and you need to listen, and you need to listen, and you need to listen some more. There's this aspect of slowing down and truly listening and being observant in a way that we often aren't, where we focus our energy then on what is going on truly around us, not being guided by where we initially want to do. We then have to use our ears and other senses to help guide us on where we need to go. It's not having a predetermined necessarily end goal in mind. Or maybe we are walking along a trail, but we're using our ears so much more that if our ears are saying, I'm hearing something, stop, we stop. Instead of the goal is the end of the trail and then I turn around and come back. No, the goal is that I suddenly need to hear and to listen and to observe. And this is a shift to becoming more observant, becoming more like a scientist. We are then being acutely aware of our surroundings and what is going on. We are taking notes. We are referencing what types of birds we're seeing. We're tracking and counting, and there's rules on how to do different types of counting and things. But we're counting the species of birds, and then we're going to use that data to be able to submit, to be able to compare across now over 120 plus years of data. These things take time. It's slowing down. Yes, there's a lot of fellowship and friendship and community that can come in from these bird counts as well. But it's also the aspect of slowing down and acknowledging and listening and being truly an observant scientist, being a truly observant person. I think these texts this week, and especially as we are in the Christmas season, that is what we are getting called out to do. If it is wisdom that can turn sorrow into joy, we have to be observant of things that are going to get us to that place of joy. And when we are in sorrow, I would argue a lot of times it is either that we are overcome with empathy or overcome with what is going on in our small circle of life. And it's not inherently wrong to get to those places where we are consumed by that, but we can't stay there forever, because that's when we start becoming like what is referenced in the wisdom of Solomon, that we become like the Israelites in Egypt, that, well, this is the way it's been, and you know what? It could be a lot worse. It's not really that bad. We'll just stay and continue to be slaves in Egypt. At least we're getting fed well. At that point, we're no longer listening to what wisdom and what God is trying to tell us. We have made predetermined ideas of what is going to happen. And we are not running an experiment anymore. We have decided what the outcome is going to be. And thus it is over. It's not even worth running. And this is counterintuitive to the whole scientific method, that yes, we have our hypothesis on what we are thinking is going to happen, but you still make up your null hypothesis to make sure that, well, if everything goes wrong, nothing should happen, or figuring out a hypothesis that is the polar opposite of what you're testing for. The hypothesis is always with the Christmas bird count is that there are birds out there, and let's find what species are there and how many roughly are there. And that's what's the beauty of it, because year to year things change. You have different weather, you have different migratory routes, patterns based off of how the weather has affected the birds. And so thus what happens? You get completely different results. I know where I grew up in doing them, we get between 30 to, I think one year we even got to like 42 species in a time where people say, well, there is no birds, or very few. We were having 40 different species of birds. It's just that we had to go and look for them. And there were certain spots where we knew they were more likely to find birds, but we had to just go and find them. And as we were on those journeys, it often led us to other things. And it was amazing how often in those times that you ended up finding something absolutely incredible. An individual bird species that you didn't expect to be there that suddenly was there. Finding some weird hybrid. Finding something unique. Finding a large number of something that is incredible. That's fun. That's enjoyable. And we would also argue it's us truly finding the joy around us. Recognizing the gifts around us and recognizing the wisdom of what God is doing. When we do that, it opens us up to not see everything as just a commodity that should be hunted. Suddenly now you've turned something that was once a huge hunting day into huge and one of the biggest conservation movements on the face of the planet. Something that didn't feel like much became something absolutely incredible. As I look here on Wikipedia, and granted this is now getting to be like 15-year-old data, what started as one count, and they did 25 different places, has now grown to where on the 113th count, so the winter of 2012 to 2013, 71,531 people participated in 2,369 locations to help get data for the betterment of humankind. For us being able to recognize, wow, look how amazing our world is. God's creation is, in particular with birds. When we actually stop and think about that, that's incredible. It started from one person proposing a bird count to go and do it as a counter movement to something, and it made something so much bigger. Was Chapman looking at conservation with this? A little bit, but I wouldn't say he would have imagined the amount of research and things that would be utilizing this data to this day. And little did Chapman probably know when he suggested it that this was going to be the longest running citizen science project in the world, bar none. That's what's incredible about this. What makes it incredible is the aspect that people are going out there and essentially looking at one in particular part of God's creation saying, what is out here, God? What surprises do we have today? And I can almost guarantee you, if you ever get the opportunity to do it, there will be a surprise. Somebody will come back with some surprise that people are happy about. And that to me is the joy of what we are striving for. That's utilizing the wisdom of what God is giving to us to go and find, and that is finding the joy that God has designed for us, the dancing that God has designed for us, to not always be sitting in sorrow, being able to find the little things, being able to find God's wisdom and steering us out in God's creation to look beyond the human experience. And I think it could be argued that God did that for us. God in three persons was out there, and it's hard for our brains to fully rationalize God in three persons, but hang with me here. God is out there and who's interacting with God's creation, and finally says the only way to get through to them is I have to go embody them. I need to be there. I need to meet them where they're at. So a part of me will go and do that. And I would argue when we think about that, when we go through that, is that not where for us to continue to find God and to seek God, then we need to at times be willing and able to go outside of the human experience to find where God is. That we need to be able to go and experience God's creation. We need to go and experience the amazing things that God has created that is outside of sometimes us, or being able to get into the nitty-gritty of us to the cellular level to be able to understand the amazing things of what God has done. And then whatever we learn there, that's the joy that we go and we take and we show and we learn. That is this whole thing. This is a text of us going and being observant scientists. That we go out and we observe and we tell others about it. Because the more that we see and the more that we use this and the more we learn from this, the truly amazing thing of God and what God does becomes evident. So the question I have for you this week is, where have you gone to go and seek the wisdom that God is trying to provide you? Where have you gone this week to go and try to find the wisdom that God is trying to provide you? And what did you find? I want to know, what did you find? I'd love to hear some responses on that, because I think when we go and seek these things, when we go and find that peace, or we go and find something amazing, we should also make sure that we're going and sharing it. That's part of this whole thing and what makes it so amazing, because in doing that, we truly get to be closer to God, and I think in a way that God desires us to be. So we're in this last Sunday of Christmas, and as we are getting toward the end of the Christmas season, make sure that you spend some time to go and seek that wisdom, go and find that wisdom, because it's necessary for us, especially in this Christmas season. So we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science. And Happy New Year. And cheers to a great 2026.